The grave was too clean. That was the thought Ju-won could never shake, no matter how many times he came here. 4 years of rain, 4 years of frost heaving the earth, and still, the white marble headstone stood pristine, unmarked by weather or grief. As if someone tended it, as if someone wanted it to last. He knelt in the damp grass anyway, the way he always did. Not because he believed in rituals. Men like him didn't pray. But here, in this quiet corner of Yongsan Cemetery, surrounded by fog and the distant sound of soul traffic, Ju-won allowed himself the one thing his empire never permitted: stillness. He pressed his thumb against the engraved letters. Kate J. Ju-won. Beloved, gone too soon. His jaw locked. His chest did what it always did, tightened like a fist was closing around his lungs. 4 years, and grief still hit him like a blade between the ribs. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the photograph. Black and white, worn soft at the edges from being handled too many times. Kate, mid-laugh, her head thrown back, her braids catching wind, her hand reaching toward the camera, toward him, like she was trying to pull him into the frame with her. He'd taken that shot in Jeju, 3 weeks before everything ended. He stared at her face the way a drowning man stares at a rope just out of reach. Your wife is still alive. The voice was small, matter-of-fact, unhurried. Ju-won's entire body went rigid. The photograph slipped from his fingers. It landed face up in the wet grass, Kate's laughing eyes looking at the gray sky. He turned slowly, the way a man turns when he is deciding, in real time, whether what he just heard was real or the first sign that grief had finally cracked something inside of him. A little girl stood 3 feet away. She couldn't have been more than 6, maybe 7. A green winter coat, slightly too big, the cuffs folded back twice. Natural hair pulled into 2 puffs on either side of her head. Dark, steady eyes that watched him the way children sometimes watch adults, with a patience that makes grown men feel exposed. She was not afraid of him. That, more than anything, was what stopped him. Everyone was afraid of Ju-won. His own lieutenants measured their words before they spoke. Rivals crossed streets to avoid him. And this child, this tiny, unbothered child, was standing in a cemetery watching him grieve and looking entirely unimpressed. What did you just say to me? His voice came out low, controlled, the voice he used to end arguments permanently. She didn't flinch. Your wife, she repeated, nodding toward the headstone with an authority that didn't belong on a 7-year-old's face. She's still alive. Ju-won's eyes cut to the grave, then back to the girl. Something cold moved through him, not quite anger, not quite hope, something more dangerous than both. He pointed at the headstone. You see that name? His voice was quiet and careful, the way it got when he was genuinely furious. That is my wife's name, carved in stone. I stood at this grave 4 years ago and I watched them lower a casket into the ground. So whatever game you are playing. My mama says names on stones don't mean anything, the girl said simply, if the box underneath is empty. The world went silent. Not the ambient silence of a cemetery, a sudden, complete interior silence. The kind that comes right before a man's understanding of everything he knows collapses. Ju-won looked at the child, really looked at her, the line of her jaw, the set of her eyes, the way she tilted her chin up slightly when she spoke like she was daring him to disagree. Something in the back of his mind lurched. Who are you? He said. His voice had changed, even he heard it. The girl reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out something small, held it in her closed fist for a moment, then opened her palm and held it out to him. A locket. Gold-plated, oval, with a tiny chip on the lower left edge exactly where Kate had knocked it against the kitchen counter, laughing at something stupid on TV the night Ju-won had given it to her. His hand went to his chest automatically. Through his shirt and the chain beneath, he felt the twin of it, the matching locket he had worn every day for 4 years, the one that held her photograph, the one he had never once removed because removing it felt like agreeing that she was gone. His hand was shaking. He hadn't noticed when that started. Where did you get that? The words came out barely above a whisper. The girl looked at the locket, then at him, then at the grave. When she looked back up, her expression wasn't smug or frightened or even particularly dramatic. She looked, impossibly, like she felt sorry for him. "My mama gave it to me," she said. "She said if I ever saw a man crying at this grave, a tall man with ink on his hands, I should show him this." She paused. "And I should tell him her name is still Kate, and she still remembers Jeju." Ju-won's knees hit the grass. Not on purpose, not as a choice. The muscles simply gave out, the same way a wall gives out when the foundation beneath it has been quietly hollow for years. He stared at the locket in the child's small palm. He stared at his wife's name on the stone. He stared at the fog rolling through the cemetery, cold and absolute, the way a lie looks when it has finally run out of room to breathe. 4 years of grief, 4 years of guilt, 4 years of running an empire with a dead man's heart because he had told himself that the only woman who had ever made him want something different was in the ground at his feet. The photograph was still lying in the wet grass. Kate, laughing, reaching toward him through a frame she had never stopped trying to cross. He picked it up. His hands were still shaking. "What is your name?" he asked the girl. She stood a little straighter. "Sky," she said. Then, quietly, with the particular gravity of a child delivering information they don't fully understand but know matters enormously. "My mama named me that because she said even on the worst days, the sky is still there. You just can't always see it." Ju-won looked at her face. The jaw, the eyes, the chin. He had been looking at those same features in a mirror his entire life. The cold in his chest cracked open, not into warmth, not yet, but into something raw and seismic and irrevocable. Because he understood, in the span of one heartbeat, that he was not kneeling at his wife's grave. He was kneeling at the altar of the most elaborate betrayal he had ever failed to see. And somewhere, in a locked room, in a building he didn't know, behind a door he hadn't thought to look for, Kate was still breathing. He rose slowly to his feet. He looked at his brother Minho's contact in his phone. He looked at the headstone. He looked at Sky, who watched him with Kate's patient, unafraid eyes. Then he put the photograph back in his pocket, reached down, and gently took his daughter's hand for the first time. "Show me," he said. "Show me everything. Welcome to our channel. If this story of buried truth, syndicate betrayal, and a father's reckoning is already gripping you, like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is. Let's build something together." Ju-won didn't speak on the drive over. He sat in the back of the black SUV with Sky beside him, one hand resting near, but not on his holster, the other gripping the locket so tightly the chain bit into his palm. Sky sat perfectly still, watching the city blur past the window with those calm, ancient eyes, like a child who had learned early that stillness was the safest thing she could offer a stranger. He called Di-hyun before they cleared the cemetery gates. "Safe house on Mappo, sweep it before I arrive. And get me Park Sung-jin, I need a DNA test done privately. Tonight," he paused. "Don't ask me why, just move." The safe house was a clean, unremarkable apartment on the 4th floor of a building that didn't appear on any of the syndicate's official ledgers. Di-hyun met them at the door, clocked the child immediately, and had the discipline to say absolutely nothing except, "Doctor is 20 minutes out." Ju-won sat across from Sky at the kitchen table under a single overhead light. He told himself he was simply watching her, assessing. It was what he did. He read people, cataloged threats, measured angles. That was all this was. But then she tilted her chin up to look at him, impatient with his silence, and the gesture hit him somewhere beneath his sternum like a closed fist. He had seen that exact expression once before in a bathroom mirror, age 9, staring down a man twice his size and refusing to blink. He looked away first. When the doctor finished the swab and quietly packed his kit, Ju-won walked him to the door. "How long?" Ju-won asked. 6 hours for preliminary confirmation. 6 hours. He returned to the kitchen, where Sky had fallen asleep at the table with her head on her arms, the locket still loosely held in her small fist. He didn't move her. He just stood there in the doorway, the photograph in his hand, looking between the child's sleeping face and Kate's laughing one. And for the first time in 4 years, grief began to curdle into something far more volatile. But the results were almost beside the point now, because Sky had said her mama gave her the locket, which meant someone had been close enough to Kate to receive instructions, which meant someone, somewhere in Ju-won's city and his world, knew exactly where Kate was and had chosen, until now, to say nothing. The question wasn't whether Sky was his daughter. The question was who else already knew. If you can't stand deceitful villains who destroy marriages for absolute power, hit that subscribe button right now and comment, "I stand for loyalty," to show you're not on Min-ho's side. Di-hyun returned at dawn with a folder thick enough to use as a weapon. He set it on the kitchen table without ceremony, pulled out the chair across from Ju-won, and sat down the way a man sits when the news he is carrying is bad enough to require a solid surface beneath him first. "The accident report," he said, pushing the first document forward. "Filed by Officer Baek Tae-soo, Mapo District. Signed, stamped, logged into the system 4 years ago, 3 days after Kate disappeared." Ju-won opened it. His eyes moved down the page with the cold efficiency of a man who had spent decades reading contracts designed to deceive him. "The vehicle entered the Han River at approximately 11:47 p.m., Di-hyun continued. "Divers were dispatched the following morning. Recovery operation lasted 6 days. He paused. "They recovered the car, a single shoe, and approximately 400 milliliters of blood from the driver's seat, typed and matched to Kate's medical records on file." Ju-won turned the page. "And the body?" Di-hyun's jaw tightened. "Never recovered. Report cites strong currents. Case closed by district supervisor within 72 hours. He slid another document across the table. "That supervisor retired 8 months later on a pension that doesn't match 30 years of public service salary." Ju-won stared at the number. His fingers went still. "The funeral," he said quietly. "Closed casket, arranged and fully paid for within 48 hours of the accident report." Di-hyun pulled out a bank transfer record, highlighted in yellow. "Paid from a shell account we've traced before. It's one of 3 we know Min-ho uses for off-ledger expenditures." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Ju-won closed the folder slowly, the way a man closes something he knows he can never unknow. 4 years ago, he had stood at a closed casket and wept over an empty box while his brother stood beside him with his hand on his shoulder. But what shattered him, what truly split the floor open beneath everything, was the second transfer Di-hyun slid forward without a word. Same shell account, same week. A payment to a private psychiatric facility, 40 kilometers outside the city. Made the same night as the funeral. Ju-won showered, changed, and was at headquarters by 9. He wore his best suit, charcoal, structured, the one Kate had once said made him look like a man who had already won whatever argument he was walking into. He had his driver take the long route so he could sit in silence and do the one thing that would determine whether he lived through the next several weeks. He put the rage somewhere small and locked it there. Not gone, never gone, but contained, pressed into a single dense point behind his sternum where it could burn without showing on his face. He had built an empire on the ability to smile at men he intended to destroy. He would not waste that skill now, of all times. The boardroom on the 32nd floor had floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides. Souls spread out beneath it like a circuit board, indifferent and glittering. 12 men sat around the long obsidian table when Ju-won entered. 11 of them straightened. Min-ho didn't. He was already leaning back in his chair at the far end, jacket off, sleeves rolled, projecting the casual authority of a man who had been running things long enough to be comfortable doing it. He looked up when Ju-won entered and smiled, the easy, practiced smile of a man with nothing on his conscience. "Brother," Min-ho gestured at the empty chair at the head of the table. "We were starting to wonder." "I was paying my respects," Ju-won said simply. He sat down, accepted the coffee someone placed before him, and opened the morning briefing like a man who had slept peacefully and dreamed of nothing. He let Minho lead the first hour. Let him talk, let him posture, let him believe the throne was already his. Ju-won listened with half his mind and memorized everything with the other half. Every alliance Minho casually referenced, every account he steered away from scrutiny, every name he mentioned just slightly too often. By the time the meeting ended, Ju-won had the outline of a trap. He walked Minho to the elevator himself, a hand briefly on his brother's shoulder, warm, familial, the gesture of a man with no suspicions. "Same time Thursday?" Minho asked. "Of course," Ju-won said. The elevator doors closed. Ju-won stood at the glass and looked at his own reflection, the composed face, the steady eyes, the suit Kate had loved, and beneath it all, that single locked point of rage burning like a coal that would not cool. What he didn't know yet was that Minho stepped back from the elevator doors and immediately reached for his phone. And the name he called wasn't one Ju-won had ever heard before. Hit subscribe if you believe corrupt criminals who exploit innocent children should face absolute justice. Comment, protect Sky, if you're riding with our protagonist. The doctor's name was Lim Cheol-soo, and he had been on Minho's payroll for 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days, a fact Dee Hyun established before the man had even stopped shaking. They brought him to a room with no windows. Not a syndicate room, Ju-won had been precise about that. A clean room. A room that could not later be described as anything other than an uncomfortable conversation. Whatever happened here would need to survive scrutiny, because Ju-won had already decided that this dismantling would be done correctly. Dee Hyun sat across from the doctor and placed the bank transfer records on the table between them without a word. Lim Cheol-soo looked at the documents, then at Dee Hyun, then at the documents again. It took 11 minutes. "She was brought in the night of November 4th, he said finally, his voice hollowed out. "Unconscious. I was told she was a psychiatric emergency, a danger to herself. I was told her name was Park Soo-yeon." He swallowed. "I knew that wasn't her real name. I knew from the first week." "And you said nothing," Dee Hyun said. The doctor didn't answer. There was no answer worth giving. "Where is she now?" Dee Hyun asked. "Still there, East Wing, 3rd floor. She's been kept on a rotating sedation protocol." He pressed his hands flat against the table like he needed to feel something solid. "She has moments of clarity, not many, but in those moments, she always asks for the same person." Dee Hyun leaned forward. "Who?" The doctor looked up. "She asks for Ju-won, every time. 4 years and she has never stopped asking." What the doctor said next made Dee Hyun push back his chair and reach for his phone before the sentence was even finished. Ju-won chose the lounge on the 28th floor because it had no cameras. Minho didn't notice that detail until the door was already locked behind him. It was a small room, leather chairs, a bar cart, the kind of space designed for conversations that never left the building. Ju-won was already seated when Minho arrived, the folder of falsified records open on the low table between them like a centerpiece. Minho stopped walking. His eyes moved from the documents to his brother's face, and something shifted in his expression, not guilt, not fear, but a rapid, practiced recalibration. "Brother." "Sit down," Ju-won said. The quiet in his voice was the kind that preceded catastrophic things. Minho sat. Ju-won didn't speak immediately. He let Minho look at the records, let him see exactly how much had been uncovered. Let the silence do its work while he studied his brother's face for the one thing he needed to confirm before he moved. Remorse. He looked for it genuinely. One flicker, one crack in the composure, and perhaps this conversation went differently. There was none. "You want an explanation," Minho said finally, "not a question." "I want to hear you say it." Minho leaned back, and the smile that crossed his face was the most honest expression Ju-won had ever seen on him, small, unbothered, almost philosophical. "She was making you soft. You were talking about walking away from everything our father built. I protected this family." "You buried my wife alive," Ju-won said. "You threw my daughter into the system like she was garbage." I made a necessary decision. Ju-won hit him before the sentence finished. What followed was not elegant. It was 4 years of grief and fury moving through a man's fists with no interest in restraint. Min-ho fought back. He had always been capable, but there was a difference between a man fighting to win and a man fighting because every alternative is worse. When it was over, Min-ho was on the floor, breathing hard, one hand raised. "You can't touch me," he said through split lips. "I have insurance. Documents, accounts, names, everything surfaces if something happens to me." Ju-won crouched down to his level, completely calm now, the rage spent and replaced by something colder and more permanent. "I'm counting on it," he said quietly. What Min-ho didn't realize, what he couldn't yet know, was that Ju-won had been recording every word since the moment the door locked. If you can't stand toxic family members who use manipulation and violence to get ahead, smash that like button and make sure you are subscribed to follow this takedown. Ju-won spent 3 days doing the most dangerous thing he had ever done in his life. Not because it required physical courage, he had that in surplus, but because what he was doing now required him to look at everything he had built across 2 decades, everything his father had bled for, every territory and account and loyal soldier, and treat it as expendable. He worked from a laptop in the Mapo safe house, while Sky slept in the next room. The International Financial Crimes Unit received the first package on Tuesday: offshore account structures, shell company registrations, 14 years of laundered capital mapped across 6 jurisdictions. Clean, organized, annotated. The kind of documentation that takes investigators years to assemble on their own. Ju-won had assembled it in 72 hours because he had built the system himself. On Wednesday, a separate package reached Interpol's sole liaison: trafficking routes, contraband logistics, the names of 3 port officials who had been on syndicate payroll since before Ju-won took leadership. He included dates, amounts, and enough corroborating evidence to make denial impossible. On Thursday, he made a single phone call to a prosecutor he had been quietly protecting from syndicate pressure for 6 years. A man who owed him nothing, but had always seemed like the kind of person who would recognize a debt that wasn't financial. "I'm sending you something," Ju-won said. "When it arrives, move quickly. You won't get a second window." By Friday morning, 3 of Min-ho's primary financial backers had frozen their assets and gone silent. 2 senior syndicate captains had stopped answering their phones entirely. Min-ho's empire was hemorrhaging, and he didn't yet know why. But Ju-won knew something else. Di-hyun had just confirmed the facility's location, its guard rotation, and a 4-hour window in the schedule that wouldn't exist again for another 30 days. The only question left was whether Kate had 30 days. They moved at 2 a.m., when the facility sat at its quietest, and the guard rotation left a 7-minute seam in the eastern perimeter coverage. 5 men, Di-hyun on point, Ju-won in the middle, which his soldiers had argued against, and he had overruled without discussion. He was not waiting in a car while someone else walked through the door Kate was behind. That was not something he was capable of. The outer fence took 40 seconds. The service entrance took less. The first resistance came on the ground floor, 2 of Min-ho's mercenaries stationed at the stairwell who made the mistake of hesitating when they saw Ju-won's face. That hesitation cost them the half-second they needed. Di-hyun moved first. It was over before it was loud. They climbed to the 3rd floor in silence, single file, the facility's sterile white corridors feeling obscenely calm for what was happening inside them. Somewhere above a distant alarm tripped, not the external alarm, an internal one, which meant someone in the building had made a phone call. They had less time than they'd planned. The east wing door was reinforced, a keypad lock and a deadbolt. Ju-won stepped forward personally, used the access code Lim Chialsu had provided under considerable persuasion, and felt something release in his chest when the mechanism clicked. 3rd floor, room 14. The doctor had been specific. He pushed the door open. The room was dim, institutional, smelling of antiseptic and stale air. A figure lay in the narrow bed facing the wall, impossibly still. Ju-won crossed the room in 4 steps and said her name once, quietly, the way you say something you have rehearsed 10,000 times and are still not ready for. The figure in the bed went completely motionless, and then slowly began to turn. If you believe true love shouldn't be ripped apart by greed and broken systems, leave a comment saying, "Justice for Kate, right now." She looked at him, the way a person looks at something they have stopped believing in. Not with joy, not immediately. Her eyes, darker than he remembered, hollowed at the edges by 4 years of sedation and fluorescent light, moved across his face slowly, like she was checking each feature against a memory she'd been told was false. "Ju-won," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse. It was the most complete thing he had ever heard. He didn't trust himself to speak. He crossed the remaining distance, sat on the edge of the bed, and took both her hands in his. She was thinner. Her braids were gone, replaced by close-cropped natural hair that framed her face differently. But her grip, when it came, was fierce, immediate, and certain. The grip of a woman who had been holding on to something invisible for 4 years and was not letting go now that it had finally arrived. "I have someone I need you to meet," he said quietly. "She's safe. She's been waiting." Kate closed her eyes. A single breath, long, shattered, released. They had 40 seconds of that before the door behind them opened. Min-ho stood in the frame, a gun leveled, 2 mercenaries flanking him. His face was a mask of controlled desperation, a man who had run every calculation and arrived at a last resort. "Step away from her," he said. Ju-won stood slowly, positioning himself between Min-ho and Kate without looking away from his brother's eyes. He raised both hands, not in surrender, but in the deliberate, visible gesture of a man who has already decided how this ends. "It's over, Min-ho." "Not yet." "The recording reached the prosecutor 2 hours ago." Ju-won's voice was flat and absolute. "Your accounts are frozen. Your captains are in custody. There is nothing left to protect." The gun didn't lower immediately. Min-ho's jaw worked silently, the architecture of his certainty collapsing in real time. When the weapon finally dropped, it wasn't courage that lowered it. It was the arithmetic of a man who had run out of moves. Di-hyun was through the door before Min-ho hit the floor. Ju-won looked down at his brother zip-tied and breathing hard against the cold tile, and felt nothing violent. No urge to finish it. Only a vast, clean exhaustion and the quiet knowledge that handing Min-ho to a legal system that now had everything was a longer, more permanent consequence than anything Ju-won's hands could deliver. He turned back to Kate. She was already sitting up, watching him with those dark, recalibrated eyes. "You chose to walk away," she said softly. Not a question, an observation, weighted with everything it meant coming from a woman who knew exactly what kind of man he had been. "I had a reason to," he said. What neither of them knew yet was that Sky, back at the safe house, had been asking Di-hyun's deputy a single question on repeat for the past hour. She wanted to know when her parents were coming home. They went to the cemetery on a Tuesday morning, when the sky was the particular pale blue that follows weeks of gray, clean, and tentative, like the world testing whether it was allowed to be bright again. Kate stood between Ju-won and Sky, one hand in each of theirs, watching 2 workers loosen the base of the white marble headstone with methodical, unhurried effort. She hadn't spoken much since the facility. She was recalibrating, reassembling the version of herself that 4 years of sedation had worked hard to dismantle. Ju-won didn't rush her. He had spent 4 years being impatient with grief, and it had cost him everything. He was done with impatience. Sky watched the workers with solemn, practical focus, the way she approached most things. When the headstone finally lifted free of the earth and was loaded onto the worker's flatbed, she looked up at Kate. "Does it feel different?" she asked. Kate looked at the rectangular void in the grass where the stone had been, the clean, ordinary earth beneath it, hiding nothing, holding no one. "Yes," she said quietly, "it does." Ju-won squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. The paperwork for his formal withdrawal from the syndicate's remaining legitimate holdings had been filed the previous week. The prosecutor's case was moving. Min-ho had not spoken a word since his arrest, which his attorney apparently considered a strategy and Ju-won considered an admission. There was a house, ordinary, unremarkable, with a garden that needed work and a bedroom Sky had already claimed by leaving her green coat on the chair inside it. No guards outside, no ledgers. No loyalty oaths or territory disputes or locked rooms. Just walls that belonged to no one dangerous. Ju-won looked at his wife and his daughter standing in the morning light on the grass and felt something he had no criminal vocabulary for, something that didn't require protecting or defending or expanding. It simply was, and it was enough. Kate turned to look at him, and the smile that crossed her face was slow and careful, like something she was relearning how to do. "Take us home," she said. He did. But 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at the new house with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, Sky, at the cemetery, on the day they removed the headstone, taken from a distance, taken by someone who had been watching. And on the back, in handwriting Ju-won didn't recognize, were 4 words. "This isn't over yet. Confirm you stand on the side of justice and family by hitting like, subscribing, and sharing this video. Don't let the bullies win. Make sure this story reaches everyone who needs to see it."